Good to see you, or good to see some familiar faces and a bit less familiar faces. So all welcome. For the next hour, we will have a conversation on the role and the efforts of Sweden in relation to its climate and sustainability agenda, looking at it from a national perspective, but also trying to broaden that landscape and look at it from an international perspective. So how is Sweden doing in those two fields globally? My name is Jesse Schage. I work as a course coordinator, but also project coordinator at Uppsala University, CEMUS. The plan for today is to kickstart with a presentation by Kevin Anderson, and then following this we'll have a panel discussion. And I really want to leave some time at the end of this hour to include also all of you into the discussion, so feel free to participate later on as well. So Kevin Anderson is professor of energy and climate change at the University of Manchester, but over the last year he has joined us here in Sweden at the Center for Sustainable Development, Uppsala University, as professor in climate change leadership. So I'll leave it at that, and the floor is yours, Kevin. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Jesse. Right, well, I've called this talk, I should say, I apologize to start with, I'm having to speak in English. I've not managed to learn Swedish yet. It's a very difficult language to master. But I've called this talk Laggards or Leaders, and we've made our best attempt at translating that into Swedish there, which I won't try and pronounce. The first one's easy, I think. Bromskloss, is that correct? So that's our best interpretation of it. And then Paris, 2 degrees C, and the role for Sweden. I'm going to start off, actually, with a climate message from the Pope. And if you haven't read the encyclical, it's probably one of the best climate change documents that's come out in the last few years, actually. The alliance of technology and economics ends up sidelining anything unrelated to its immediate interests. Consequently, the most that one can expect is superficial rhetoric, sporadic acts of philanthropy, and perfunctory expressions of concern for the environment. Whereas any genuine attempt to introduce change is viewed as a nuisance based on romantic illusions. And what I'm going to try to sort of touch on really is that the solutions to climate change, the responses to climate change that are going to be more appropriate now, are not those that are wrapped up in the alliance of technology and economics, but are those that are latent, that are hidden within the romantic illusions, and we are using that language to almost stop us thinking about the real opportunities that we have. I'm not going to say much about sustainable development. My colleagues on the panel today know much more about it than me, but I'm just going to touch on it briefly here, about sustainable development and climate change. Sustainability is a very complex issue. I mean it in its formal sense, not just complicated, but complex. And it's captured, at least in part, by the 17 SDGs that you're all probably very familiar with. Climate change, by contrast, is a much simpler issue. It's only one small facet of sustainability, though it seems to dominate much of the discussion at the moment. The solutions for climate change are focused on the near term. If we're really serious about climate change, we are talking about between now and really 2030. And I don't mean waiting till 2030, I mean starting now. We have to, principally, it's just a matter of stopping carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gases. But if we fail on climate change, we will fail on the SDGs. And that's the real issue there, that we have to solve climate change. But also responding to climate change will be detrimental to some of the SDGs. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but just for example, if you think of the SDG 14, life below water, and then you look at some of the responses we're looking at, particularly from the sort of area I come at in relation to energy, and if you look at marine energy, we're looking at massive biomass production from the marine environment. Now that will have significant coastal and near sea, near coast repercussions. Tidal current turbines, like large wind turbines underneath the sea, that were already being put out in some parts of Europe. These have quite big implications locally. Tidal barrage schemes have huge sustainability implications, but can produce lots of energy, very low carbon energy. Wave power changes the erosion patterns around the coasts. And then you've got global shipping of biomass, huge quantities of biomass, in most of the models equivalent to the same size of the current fossil fuel industry. So, there are quite a few potential conflicts between the SDGs and responding to climate change. But I'm going to focus here on climate change, particularly on the Paris interpretation of it. And just as a backdrop, and if anyone has heard me speak before, you'll have seen these slides, that we're in 2017 now. The first IPCC report came out in 1990, 27 years ago, and we have done nothing on climate change since. Lots of rhetoric, lots of meetings, but nothing that's reduced our emissions. The emissions this year will be 60% higher than they were in 1990. 60% after 27 years of concern about an issue. I mean, you couldn't fail more badly than that, really. And even in Sweden or the UK, our lifestyles are no lower carbon now. We like to think of ourselves living in progressive countries. But our lifestyles have remained high carbon. Once you factor in aviation and shipping, there's no emissions change, really, for the wealthy of us around the world. The other great thing that has happened, I think, in the latest IPCC reports is it's provided us a very clear scientific foundation for thinking about climate change. In terms of temperature, it's not a focus on 2030 or 2045, as the new climate change law is in Sweden, or 2050, which is the Climate Change Act in the UK. This has no scientific basis. It never has had any scientific basis. The only thing that matters are carbon budgets in terms of temperature. And this relates to the build-up of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere every day. I'm not going to go into those in detail here, but they are the fundamental premise of linking temperature with our response in terms of mitigation. The Paris Agreement, which you're probably all reasonably familiar with, 32 pages of exciting text, or very exciting if you're a lawyer and less so for the rest of us. And it lays out, I would argue, very clear commitments to stay well below 2 degrees C, to take action to stay below 2 degrees centigrade, and attempt to hold the temperature rise to only 1.5, because there are many people in the world who will suffer very severely at 2 degrees. To do this on the basis of the best science, and I would argue the IPCC is probably the best example of that at the moment, and also to take serious account of equity issues. So well below 2, 1.5, best science and equity frame the climate change agenda and lay out our commitments. But to whom are these commitments made? They're made to these people who are already suffering from the climate change that we are knowingly causing and imposing upon them. They're made to these people, our own children that we have breakfast with in the morning. Our commitments are made to these groups of people. They're made to future generations, whatever they may look like. They're made to people like us today. Look at the breakdown of Schengen in the EU, just because of a few migrants from Syria. You know, we already see breakdowns of systems that we think are relatively robust, but they're not. They're made to other species over millennia. And they're made to this wonderful, beautiful blue planet that is our home. These are where our commitments are made. And we have to remind ourselves, when we say these things are very challenging, well, yeah, but these are the people we're making these commitments to. So if we go back to Paris and try and quantify it, and just get some sort of handle as to where we're heading. This is the emissions that we've had since 1980. And before Paris, we were heading up in this sort of direction, so very high levels of temperature increase, something like a 4 to 6 degrees C temperature rise. That's the sort of direction that we were heading in before we had Paris. And then with Paris, we had the pledges that were made by every country of the world, and that holds us nearer to 3 to 4 degrees C of warming. But that is still really a different planet from where we live today. So that's it's not a good place to be. And it's also worth bearing in mind that we're only going in that direction because of the financial crisis, not because of judicious climate change policies. But what we have promised and committed our own children and other parts of the world is that we will act to stay below 2 degrees centigrade. And just look at the curve if you can see that. It's a quite bright screen, but where that curve goes to. That goes to about full decarbonisation at a global level by 2050. And that's no time from today, full decarbonisation. And for carbon emissions, it has to be zero. It can't just be low. Low isn't good enough, which has big implications on what technologies are viable. And also Paris lays out, as I said before, an equity dimension. So the wealthy parts of the world, the UK, Sweden, the US, the EU and so forth, have to make these changes more rapidly than the poor parts of the world. So if you played that out in Sweden, the headline commitment for Sweden would look something like, if we believed that Paris was important, if we thought we wanted to base our approaches on science, then we would have to have about 12% per annum reduction every single year starting now. At the minimum, at least 12% every year. That's a 75% reduction in our emissions by 2025. Full decarbonisation of Sweden's energy system, and that includes its planes and its ships as well as all of its terrestrial energy by 2035. Just think where that is from today. It's just around the corner from now. And this is for 2 degrees centigrade, not for 1.5. It'd be much, well, I would argue it's not viable anymore for 1.5. Now, how does this stack up against the climate change law for Sweden? Well, these are the historical emissions according to, I won't try and pronounce the NVV, but your Environmental Protection Agency. So it's the NVV projections. That's where the historical emissions have come from. If Sweden was to play its fair part in Paris, it would have to look something like this in terms of reducing emissions. But actually what we see from the projections is it's going to carry on quite high for quite a long time. And then without any clear policy framework that's going to move it, at the moment it's going to go from there down to this sort of direction. And it's also worth bearing in mind that the emissions from the EPA do not include aviation and shipping, which represent well over 10% of Sweden's emissions. So it's much more challenging than this. So, you can see the huge gap between what you would need to deliver for 2 degrees centigrade and what, in fact, your climate change law is delivering. Your climate change law, as it stands, is somewhere in line with a 3 to 4 degrees C of warming. So one of the most progressive countries in the world has set in place a climate change law that it pretends is for 2 degrees C or 1.5, but actually is more in line with 3 or 4. And the same story could be said for the UK as well. So how do we get to there? Is it possible to move from where we say we're going to go to where we promised our children and poor people that we're going to make every effort to hold to 2 degrees? Is 2 degrees C a viable goal? Now, I'm not going to go into this now in any detail. There's just one area I want to touch on. I am an engineer, and I think there are plenty of engineering options for trying to respond to this problem, both on the demand side, on trying to do things about making the appliances we have, whether that's cars or computers, more efficient, but also on the supply side, changing to, we know what the low carbon energy supply options are. There are plenty of them out there. We know how to do much of this. This is not beyond our ability. We have all the skill sets for this. It will take quite a lot of time, and it will not hold us to our 2 degrees C carbon budget. Nothing like it. And therefore, we have to think about other dimensions that need to work alongside it. And I'm just going to touch on equity here, on the immediate and near term, what we could be doing today. There's a huge asymmetry in carbon dioxide emissions, and basically in energy consumption around the globe. But there will be in this room, there will be in Almedalen, there will be across Sweden, and there's huge asymmetries within the UK. 50% of global emissions come from just 10% of the global population. You start to realize what that skew looks like. It's really worth reading the Chancellor and Piketty report on this, as to how emissions are skewed to certain groups. Indeed, the Oxfam report is also very good on this. If the top 10% of global emitters reduce their carbon footprint to the level of the average European citizen, that would be a 1/3 reduction in global emissions. 1/3. The Paris Agreement has no reduction by 2030. So if we really thought climate change was a serious issue, all we'd have to do is ask that 10%, at least initially, just to reduce their footprints to the level of the average person in the EU. Is that really too challenging? And that would be a 1/3 cut in global emissions. We haven't done that, and that shows how little we really care about climate change. And we know who's in the 10% group. It's not that we don't know who to ask. Could you reduce your emissions? We know who's in there. Climate scientists are in there. They're clearly flying around the world telling everyone else to reduce their emissions except for their own. The policymakers, they're no better. I don't know what the expression is for a collective group of people that come to Almedalen. We were talking this with Jesse, so we've come up with Almedalians, which sounds quite alien to us, but and maybe to other people in the world it looks quite alien. So Almedalians, I would guess, pretty much with the odd exception, will be in that 10% group. If you flew here, if you fly at all, you're in that 10% group. So we know who they are. They're our friends and families. And equity reframes the whole agenda. It is not, in terms of reducing our emissions, it is not about 7.5 billion people. It's probably about 1 to 1.5 billion people that really matter in the time frame that we have to respond to climate change. This huge asymmetry is a huge asymmetry of responsibility. And there are massive opportunities, as I tried to show here, and just reducing emissions of that 10% will move us in the right direction. It's not enough, but it's certainly moving in the right direction. And the great thing is that 10%, these are the people who can provide a real example to others. If we see the Leonardo DiCaprios of this world and the Almedalians of this world starting to demonstrate by how they do their lives, live their lives, as genuinely being low carbon, that's a really good example to others. And I would argue that we could imagine that being one of the suite of catalysts that could drive system change. And it could be quite rapid, but we're not doing that. The 10% emissions are going up every year. Climate change demands now, because we've chosen to fail for 27 years, and it was a choice to fail, it demands now system change. If we interpret Paris through the logic of carbon budgets, then it's going to beg fundamental questions of our norms, our paradigms, our values. We're going to require something like a Marshall-style reconstruction of Europe in terms of our energy system. You know, like after the Second World War, it's that sort of change in productive capacity we're going to require to shift our energy system to be zero carbon. We're going to have a huge shift towards very efficient end-use appliances. But that won't be enough. We're going to need to see profound changes in behavior and practices of people like us and people who are aspiring to be like us. We need to develop economic models that are fit for purpose. The ones we have today have nothing to do with climate change or system level issues. And we should stop listening to the economists on this. Well, at least the economists who follow the sort of neoclassical marginal economic model. And we're looking at system level change. We need serious consideration of inter- and intergenerational equity. We haven't really seriously considered those at all. There've been lip service paid to them. This has to start now and be completed in 3 decades. That's all we have. It's incredibly quick. What would this mean for Sweden if it wanted to become a leader rather than, say, a laggard? I'm not saying it's either, but if you imagine it becoming one. The climate change law should be based on carbon budgets for 2 degrees centigrade, not for 3 or 4. It should be informed explicitly by equity, which it is not at the moment. It should use territorial-based emissions from within Sweden, because it has direct controls of those, but it should be guided very clearly by consumption-based emissions. They are really important. They are the ones that tell us about the carbon intensity of our lifestyles. We want to make sure we have real mitigation. We do not rely on negative emission technologies and other spurious, speculative, Dr. Strangelove, for anyone that's seen the film, technologies for the future. These things that suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere rather than us having to mitigate our emissions today. We need to complement our efforts here with support for the Global South, not as aid, but as reparation. We owe the Global South because we are imposing impacts upon them. And we have also we're requesting them not to use fossil fuels that we use to become wealthy. So we need to have reparation for the poor parts of the world. But Sweden, I think, as a Brit coming over here from quite a backward country in the UK, you come here and I can see the strong elements of a social contract that is here. You still trust your authorities. It still has a very strong and I think mostly well-deserved reputation in Sweden. So it really has the capacity to be a catalyst for change within the EU, and that could be then a catalyst for change at a global level. So I think Sweden, I'm sorry to say that I think Sweden has some additional responsibility over and above many other parts of the world. But we've got a long way to go. We've made our commitments to these people. We've made our commitments to our children. And yet just walk down here in Almedalen week to the yacht arena. And what do you see? Jet skis and yachts like this. Do we really care about our children? People flew here. And people came here on these obscene vehicles. And then we claim we care about climate change. So we've got a long way to go, but we know what to do. Sink these for a start. So hopefully the next year there will be none of those things in the yacht basin down there. But I'm going to finish off with a message of hope, because I think there are plenty of things that we can do. And this is taken from Robert Unger. It's a quote I often use. At every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is that we lack the clarity and imagination to conceive that it could be different. What we know about the future is it will be radically different, either because we have reduced our emissions and we head towards a low carbon or zero carbon and prosperous future, or because we haven't bothered to reduce our emissions and we will hand on to our children and bequeath to other future generations a catastrophic future with very serious levels of climate change. So the future will be radically different. And it's up to us to think of a more prosperous, upbeat future. So on that final note, thanks for listening.
Thank you, Kevin. And now to broaden this discussion, I really want to invite our 3 panelists. So welcome to you 3. Today, joining us, we have Erik Westholm, professor at the Department of Urban and Rural Development at the Swedish Agricultural University, SLU. We have Ranjula Bali Swain, professor of economics at MISUM, Stockholm School of Economics and Södertörn University. And finally, Hanna Hansson, research officer at the Swedish government delegation for the 2030 agenda. So welcome to all of you. Now, leader or laggard, or exception or exceptional. Sweden is often held as a champion in the sustainability and climate field. But a question that I would like to open this debate with is first of all, how are we doing in those regards? Some of you are working with the SDGs, and so I would like to just open the conversation with how well are we doing in those fields?
I don't know, should I start? As an economist, and especially since Kevin has already said that we shouldn't listen to economists. Thank you. Which I don't belong to. Well, a lot of my research, thank you for a very interesting presentation, Kevin, and for setting the discussion for the panel. What I thought I could do was begin by talking a bit about my own research. And what we have done is, so the question that we have is Sweden a leader or a laggard? And one way of answering that question is actually to look at what Sweden is doing vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And if I look at some of the recent work that has been done in evaluating sustainable development, the goals in terms of meeting sustainable development and so on, what we can go on is some of the reports that we see from the Overseas Development Institute, for instance, and then from 2015, and then the gold standard reports of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, written by Jeffrey Sachs and a whole team of researchers. And if we look at what they come up with, Sweden is, in fact, number one as far as the sustainable development, meeting the Sustainable Development 2030 agenda is concerned. What we have done with a team of mathematicians and statisticians is a couple of papers, one of which has been published recently. And we find through our research that Sweden, in fact, is amongst the top 5, if not number 1, as far as meeting the Sustainable Development agenda is concerned. Then I should also emphasize that underlying the concept of sustainable development is a combination of these 3 pillars: the economic, the social, and the environmental pillar. I don't know if I'm talking too much. Tell me. In a paper that we are in the process of writing, actually, what we find is that when it comes to the set of developing countries, the ones that have actually not contributed as much to the accumulated, carbon emission and so on, greenhouse gases, they should actually focus on their economic and social agenda. And when it comes to developed countries, they have to focus on the economic, social, and the environmental policies. But if we really look at the magnitude of the impact towards social development, sustainable development, what we find is that the social factors are more important, and the environmental factors are more important for the developed countries. So for countries like Sweden, that's the direction in which they should go. And if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly at Sweden, we see that Sustainable Development Goal 8, for instance, where we are talking about decent work and economic growth, Sweden is actually not doing as well as it should be doing. So it's in the red and needs to do a lot more. Sweden also needs to improve, despite being number 1 in terms of as compared to the rest of the world. It needs to improve on meeting goals 2, on hunger, on education, goal number 4, goal number 5 on gender equities and so on. Goal number 12 on responsible consumption and production that you've been discussing a lot is also very important. And then goals 13 to 15 on climate change, marine life, and life on land. These are goals in which there is a lot of scope of improvement as far as Sweden is concerned.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
I'll stop you there and I'll see if there's any other reactions from the rest of the panel. Hanna?
Yeah, sure. Is this working? Yeah, it is. Yeah, first of all, thank you, and happy to be here. I think that the question is excellent, really, and I think to get any type of change, we should maybe be a bit harder on Sweden. because really saying you're the best doesn't really get that sense of like, and I need to step up my game and do a little bit better. So in the Swedish national delegation that the government put in place, we're trying to send the message that, yes, if you compare Sweden to other countries, we're doing well, but that's really not interesting at all. Because the 2030 agenda, as well as the climate change agenda, they're both agendas for change. And if you read the declaration of the Sustainable Development Goals, it says that you should bring those goals home, translate them to your national setting, and they should mean that you're raising your ambition. So I think it's not irrelevant to compare Sweden to other countries, but we've done that now. And now, so what we're trying to do is to look at where Sweden is standing right now, how much better do we have to be doing? Because if you're the best, yeah, you should be judged a little harder than to move forward. So our main message has been the leadership and raising the ambition. And then we've kind of tried to develop this Swedish welfare concept to a sustainable welfare model, and what that really means would be in Sweden's case to move with these 3 pillars of sustainable development at the same time. And so I think that will be my main message to start off, because it just gets really boring if you end up with, yeah, we're doing so well, because clearly we have all these challenges, but also really, really excellent points and so much involvement right now around the Sustainable Development Goals from more or less all actors in society. We have private sector in there for their reasons. We have academia. So I think we've got a good opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you. You would like to add something, Erik?
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, the idea of Sweden as a model state has obviously great roots in the welfare model, whether we have visits over decades from all over the world to Sweden to look at the way that we solve the equity problems, maybe better than others, at least for a while. And then we have tried to repeat that message in various sectors over time. For instance, we have in forestry, we try to market the Nordic forestry model without having it at place. So we should be careful to go with calling ourselves a leader. We can have that ambition, but we should have to do that transformation first. To become a model, you have to be a model in a fundamental way. So I think it's great that in the governmental declaration it stated that we should be a model, we should take the lead, we should be best in the world. But then it all comes down to, are we heading that way? And I think you're not really, you're not so optimistic when you listen to Kevin on that. I think when Kevin says people shouldn't come here with the yachts next year, I think next year Almedalen should have climate change as the main theme for all the seminars. That would be motivated by the picture we got from Kevin today.
That's a good recommendation. What do you think, Kevin? You want to add anything to this?
Well, I think I laid out my pitch in my presentation, but I gather that Sweden's thinking about building a new airport up north so people can fly to ski in the north of Sweden. Is that in line with our Paris commitments and our commitments to our children? You recently sold a coal mine rather than closing it down. Was that in line with the commitments? You clear-cut fell rather than do selective logging. Is that with the commitments? You have a car company that produces things that are basically just tanks without a gun. That's Volvo, huge, far too large, 70 kilograms of flesh inside and 2,000 kilograms of Volvo. Is that in line with Paris commitments? It may be doing better than the rest, but that's not saying very much.
But then I want to jump on some of those points that you've already raised. What could be approaches? How can we address some of these issues? And I'm talking from a research perspective, but also policy or agenda and so on. Any thoughts on this, on how to go forward?
I think, as I'm a social scientist, I think we have a major responsibility, because this is a kind of an elite project to understand the situation and communicate it. And it's because that we have this time lag between activities in the landscape causing the carbon emissions and the understanding of the effects of those emissions and the consequences of those emissions, the time lag, the temporal dimension makes the whole thing so difficult. And I think that social science has a great responsibility here. And also to try to make clear that social change is a matter of a social struggle going on, to recognize the empowered dimension of this transformation that we need to make. And in the climate debate, we always hear the we, that we have to, because time is 5 to 12 and so, but we have to take into pieces this we and look at actors, what they do and what they don't know or don't do. And I think we need a whole new terminology to come to closer to some kind of discussion on this great transformation. So, for instance, we should be clear on what is resistance to change, what is avoidance, what is delay. If my vice chancellor at my university says that, well, we should stop flying between Stockholm and Gothenburg, and some at the university would say, yes, we're heading towards some kind of a climate activity from the university lead, while others would say this is just a delays strategy because no one flies that way. We have our activities in the south and in the north and in Stockholm. So we have to kind of get to grips with what happens here and who is doing what, and realize that it's a social struggle to have a social transformation.
Thank you. On the other side of the panel, want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I could go into with examples to explain, why is it, this is not an easy thing to do. I mean, we can ask, it's easy to say, let's ask people to change their consumption patterns, but these are not easy things to do. And let me just explain that, because there are inbuilt trade-offs. So we have, for instance, the 17 goals, and there are things like economic growth on one, employment, you have health, you have education, but it is possible that you can make choices or policy, the same policy can have different implications. It can put you 2 steps forward as far as your economic growth is concerned, 10 steps back as far as environment is concerned, and perhaps, a 1 step forward on the social. So how do you make those choices between difficult trade-offs? For instance, if you change your consumption and the impact it has on employment, how does the politics of it all work? So, and then there is technology, and it's easy to say that let's go in and make these investments in technology, but it's not that easy for inventions to, innovate and then become commercialized. And there are like financial systems there are markets there, and those are the only systems that we have working within the economy. So there are complex issues there. So let me just give an example from the Swedish Energy Agency and try to explain the complexities of the government agencies in making these decisions. For instance, the Swedish Energy Agency has come up with this really excellent report on 4 futures. But they begin by qualifying that this report and these future scenarios that they're describing do not meet the Sustainable Development Goals. These scenarios do not meet the targets for the Paris Agreement. And they come up with these 4 scenarios. The first is more growth-oriented. The other is like limited resources, recognizing that, and then going in for equity distribution, kind of fair distribution. Then the third scenario is on consumers managing their own needs. And the fourth is like smart innovations and commercialization. Now, if we look at the projections that they make for 2035 and 2050, the scenario that actually comes up with the lowest projections for energy consumption or energy use is actually the scenario where there is recognition that there is limited resources, a recognition of that fact. And so it would be something like what you're suggesting. We try to curtail our use of. However, as an agency, it's unable to kind of make these choices because these are complex choices. There are a number of stakeholders, actors in there. And then the objectives, whether they are political, economic, and environmental, they don't match. The time periods over which they are deciding, making these decisions are very different. So I just wanted to point that aspect out.
Yeah, thank you. Hanna?
Yeah, a few things. The first thing I think is quite interesting is continuing on the leadership thing. When the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, the Swedish Prime Minister walked up on stage in the UN together with 8 other leaders, and he said, "Hey, Sweden's going to be a champion for the 2030 agenda. We're going to be best in the world, and we're going to lead this." At that time, I was on the other side, so I was working for a non-profit organization, and that's a dream. If you have the Prime Minister saying that, that's, it's very hard then to not have a sit down with that person, because he said that he would make sure Sweden was a leader on that. So we set up a meeting with the Prime Minister, and we said, all right, this is excellent news, so what's the plan? Well, we don't have a plan. We just want to inspire others by being inspiring. And I said, oh, yeah. So how are you going to inspire them? Well, we don't need to take the action ourselves, but we're hoping others can then do that. And I said, you ever heard of the expression learning, kind of inspiring by doing yourself and then other follows? So that was an interesting one. So first of all, maybe, make a little action plan before you claim to be a leader. Although, of course, they've done a lot since. But I think the other thing that there are 2 goals or 2 areas that I think illustrate the complexities of the SDGs really well. And one is the sustainable consumption and production. Because if you look at that, you come to the question, who's responsible? And as a citizen, Hanna, I like to say, it's the government. They should just, make sure we have the right subsidies and taxes, and they should regulate the corporations, and they should do all that. But then when I go to my job, I also realize that wait a minute, it's the individuals. They need to change their consumption patterns. They need to not fly to Almedalen, so the responsibility lays with everyone, and also with the rich countries and the poor countries alike. So I think we really can't kind of point fingers in this game. We all have to figure out what we need to do in our setting. And the inequality goal, which is goal 10, but also the overarching message of the Sustainable Development Goals is leave no one behind, which is really, that's a statement. That's the other way around, because that goes back to the individual level and to the political level. It's like, well, the Swedish government has to make policies that are fine with less developed countries moving ahead, while Sweden maybe steps back in some areas. But it also means that I have to make a choice of maybe, giving my money to someone else, or being, not when I rent out my apartment in Stockholm, not rent it out to someone who doesn't own an apartment to a higher price that it's worth, because I can make myself a little bit of money, but maybe say, hey, you can stay in my apartment because I'm much wealthier than you are. So again, this kind of illustrates that we're all going to have to get uncomfortable and start working on this, I think.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything, Kevin, or should I?
Just quickly, coming again as a British person coming here, you have all of the requirements at your fingertips. You're a highly educated population. You're a very wealthy population, so you have the wherewithal to make the changes. There's an enormous renewable energy potential actually within Sweden, so geographically it's really well suited to addressing these issues. You have a lot more trust in your society than lots of other parts of the world. You do trust your authorities, which does allow you to play with regulations in a way that is more difficult in other parts of the world, or indeed taxation. And I may be overplaying this, and I know Erik might pull me down on this, but I think that the sort of, as I understand it, the folkhemmet, I don't try and pronounce it in Swedish, sort of interpretation of the world is quite different from the sort of laissez-faire economic liberalism that has dominated the UK, the US, and to some extent other parts of Europe. And I gather that is gradually, its tendrils are coming in Swedish life. So that, I don't think that's a good thing. But you still have something that's quite distinct from other parts of the world. And I think that combination of all those things, from highly educated, wealthy, lots of renewables, a different social model at the moment anyway, that does give you scope for leadership that other countries like the UK will struggle to demonstrate. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I think you have all the tools at your disposal to do that.
You want to add anything, Erik?
Yeah.
Go on.
No,
Please.
well, I wouldn't object to that, but I
Okay.
think also that we
Yeah,
actually
careful.
have examples, splendid examples to provide. The transformation of the Swedish heating and cooling sector in our cities is a world-leading example of a fundamental transformation from 90% fossil dependent to 95% renewables, for instance, the way that we heat our towns and cities in Sweden, and it's really unknown to most citizens. We made that. It took us 20-25 years, but we made it. So there are examples where we could provide, and it's very much, to me, very much linked to the welfare state model, with the planning monopoly that our municipalities have, and the loyalty they have with the parliament, and the systematic work on various levels, with Sweden being the first country in the world with a carbon tax, 1992, and then heading on with the investment schemes for renewables given from the state to the municipalities, etc. So we made such a big transformation.
I want to extend the discussion and take Sweden and put it into a global context. We've seen from Kevin's presentation that reaching the climate law that the government passed earlier this year in February, so 0 or 85% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2045, seems a rather difficult enterprise. It will be really, really challenging. But with this in mind, what can Sweden do about this, given if it wants to have a fair chance at reaching that goal, but in a global context, so it has responsibilities over other nations as well, or does it?
I think that one of the strengths of Sweden is its good reputation. We still have that, and that's great, really. If you look on the development side, Sweden is sort of like a development superpower in the sense that we've been very loyal. We've had, in the sense that we've kept a high official development assistance, and we're often a rather good partner to developing countries compared to sometimes our other EU peers. So there's a good kind of ground to work on there. I think that it's been interesting to see now that the Minister for Development or International Cooperation is also the Minister for Climate, because that's really a reflection of the Sustainable Development Goals in the sense that they're not separate. So, and you can already see that change where they're looking at, well, I guess there is a realization that we can't work on poverty if we don't work on climate change at the same time, because guess who's most affected by climate change and everything else that's terrible? It's the people living in poverty. So I think there has been like a recognition of that, and I think there's a lot of potential in that and kind of bridging the gap between those two. But then I think it was interesting to see both in the Paris Agreement but also in the climate law, it's a bit concerning then that when they talk about reducing emissions, it's only within your own country. Because as far as I know, that's not really how it works. So I think that Sweden could be even more progressive by then adopting rules that reflects that we're going to make we're going to try to reduce emissions globally, or if we can't, we're going to maybe increase our official development aid to climate-related work and stuff, which is fairly high, but there's a lot that could be done there.
Thank you. Ranjula, you want to add something?
Yeah, I can. First of all, it's about trade-offs, and if you look at the global data, economic and social kind of progress moves in the opposite direction as compared to environmental kind of progress. And to reconcile the two, there are some steps that can be taken, and one would be, of course, investments in health, decreasing wasteful consumption, and investment in clean energy. And these things are expensive to do. We need to make investments. And investments, globally it has been calculated that about 3 to 4% of the world's GDP is what it would take to move these together in the same direction. In Sweden, then, one would interpret like how much investments are we going to make globally? Because within the Paris Agreement, there is a commitment towards other countries. Have we done that? It's not very clear. The second issue that one needs to think about is, one is about investment, but also about the planning being non-binding and it being, as you mentioned, Hanna, national and at the regional level. And how do you make it like more binding, the plans that need to be followed? And there's a lot of, I think the private sector, the public sector, the politicians, everybody's committed to it. But when it comes to making the hard choices, things fizzle out. You can't expect a politician to say, go down with your consumption. It's going to affect the production, ultimately. The fall in demand is going to, and that's going to have an impact on employment. And at some point of time, people are going to figure that out. And it's not something that a politician who wants to come back into power another 4 or 5 years is. Yeah,
okay. And on this side of the panel, Erik?
I think that is really a key issue, that there is no popular backing for a radical climate or DSG politics, and that is the main change with the Paris Agreement and the appearance of the DSGs, is that now the global community in a way is finished with the question, have a suggestion, an agreement, something to implement. And then it falls down to nation states, and Sweden have this high stake in the governmental declarations and in all places, but yet very little happens from there and downwards in society. And isn't it amazing that we cannot process a carbon tax on 80 kronor for a domestic flight in Sweden, because that people wouldn't like it, although flight prices have gone down so much over the last 20 years. So there is a fundamental gap here that our environmental ministers would fall off the chairs.
And
for
that's the
such a thing.
inequality. There you get it again. It's like, if you can afford to fly, you can pay 80 crowns more, but I don't want to make that change. The politicians should be making the changes. So it's just a great illustration of.
One very difficult question, I think, is that we have the development goals from the UN that we're talking about here in the same, in parallel with the carbon politics and the Paris Agreement, and the DSGs. They require a lot of complexity, understanding of complex relations, trade-offs to be made, and so. While the climate issue is so clean, as Kevin provides it, and so, and the fact that if we fail on climate, all of the others will be threatened or gone as well. So how should we focus here? Because the DSGs, the complex message, is so hard to get the public backing on. It's so all this complexity. How can we kind of protect people from having to learn about all these complexities in order to stand and back a radical climate policy? I think that's a kind of a key issue, because we need simple messages and solutions and advices to people to get the social movement backing the climate transformation needed.
Yeah, national politics. And you had a comment, Kevin?
I think if we are serious about the climate agenda, and that means we're serious about our future, and certainly the SDGs as well, then we have to recognize this is a fundamentally different world. This is nothing like the world we live in today. We can't try and say, how do we adjust the model that we have today? The model we have today has got us to where we are today. We're not going to solve the problem just by carrying on with that same model with a few tweaks and adjustments. So when it comes to things like, we have to change our consumption patterns, and that probably the levels of consumption for many of us, and certainly in that top 10%, and that will mean it will have employment implications. But then we can solve those problems. Why are we still working in 2017, 5 or sometimes even 6 days a week? We've had all of these things that have helped us with productivity since the 1950s. The promise that we'd actually only have to work 3 days a week. And in 2017, I'm working more hours in 2017 than I did when I first started to work in 1978. It doesn't seem to me that we've actually got these benefits back. And it's because the model hasn't allowed us to do that. we are going to have to fundamentally rethink the world in which we live. And that is not going to be, don't have any choice about that. That will be either imposed upon us by the climate change implications of not doing so, or we make the choice and we try to do it in a more reasoned fashion. So I think we have to very seriously question the whole sort of concept of infinite economic growth. And as someone who did a lot of thermodynamics in my background, that's it's just blatantly obvious. You cannot have infinite economic growth, however you may tweak the calculations and the substitution. So we're going to have to question that. We're going to have to question substitution, consumption issues. We're going to have to look at how do you reframe an economy? How do you reframe employment? What is the purpose of a good life for the citizen on a prosperous, low-carbon world? These big, fundamental philosophical questions are part of dealing with climate change. And at the moment, I think we're reluctant to answer them. We say, how can we add another little adjustment to a legislation there, or a slight carbon tax there? That's just delaying tactics.
You want to add anything?
Yeah, I want to, because I completely agree. I think that the economic system has to fundamentally change, and maybe even the political system, because it's limited to, your own political voters, and when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about a global issue. So there's just a disconnect as far as the time period is concerned. The people concerned in terms of voting for you is but when we talk about a fundamental change in the economic system, I mean, we look at the growth of capitalism and this of consuming more and leading to greater satisfaction, well-being, what have you. How do you fundamentally how do you make such mammoth changes, and what does it leave you with? I mean, will it be chaos, or so it's and who is going to who are going to be the agent of those changes? Because there is you have a status quo in place, and so those are difficult questions to answer.
Yeah, okay, I think Erik has a comment.
You are the economist here, aren't you? So is it a breakdown for capitalism that Kevin is suggesting?
Yeah. And I would actually second that, but the real question is not agreeing on substituting that. The real question is, what do you substitute it with? What kind of system? And it's not that easy to figure out. Yeah.
There are. I'm not saying that again. These are any perfect examples. Yeah. But if you plot, and I've said this a few times at events here, if you plot various human well-being indices against either energy consumption, income, carbon dioxide emissions, what you get, you find a small sweet spot of countries that have very high female literacy rates, life expectancy, low infant mortality. And I'm not saying these are perfect countries, but these countries actually are not Sweden, and not the UK or France, wherever it may. They're places like Costa Rica and Cuba. So there are some examples of countries that seem to be able to, and when you look at the indices, they seem to tick most of the indices that we try to objectively use to say, is this a good quality of life? And have much lower consumption. You find this, the Americans and the Qatars, they're way out over here on the graph with no improvement in quality of life, but they're consuming like there's no tomorrow. Well, there will be no tomorrow if they carry on consuming. So I think there are some tentative examples of what sort of direction we need to move in.
I'm aware of time here, and I really want to leave some space for the audience. So are there any questions? I'm going to walk around to you with a microphone.
On the issue of leading all laggards, I mean, obviously we need a great change, and then we need to change also in the education. So how do you see the Swedish universities? Are they leading all laggards in sustainable development?
Can I start? If you work at the university, you would love to see it as an arena for change. If I look at the university I work at, we have a very good measuring of our climate impact of the university activities, which tells us that the climate impact is worsening. It's not coming closer to the stated aim that we have at the university, and it's so far from heading towards the Paris Agreement, so it's scary to see those curves. And we were 85 people at the university addressing the vice chancellor on this and saying that we have to to look at the university activities in a more serious way, and we don't really get any response because it's based on continued flying and everything like that. It's a university for agricultural sciences, so we have a veterinary faculty, which makes a discussion on the cow's impact of the climate very difficult. We know that the consumption of ruminant meat in Sweden have a climate impact equal to all the private cars, for instance. So it would be really easy to, if we reduced our ruminant idislar meat consumption with 50%, that would be a major step. But we cannot even have that discussion because the cow is more holy in Sweden than in India. And also it's a sector university, so we have all kinds of business industry interventions into funding. We have to supply the solutions that actors today want for their activities today. And the future is then normally colonized by their ideas on the future. So it's I'm sad to say the universities are not taking the lead on this. And arguing the same way as everyone else, that our share is so limited. Of course, the biggest thing would be to have this as a major issue in the education system, that every student in the school and every student at the university had to address these kind of futures that we're heading towards as a main project, because that's what they're going to deal with in their occupational life.
I'm going to interrupt you there. Hanna, you had a point?
No, I'm not from the university world in the same sense, or that's not, I have been there, but I'm not there. So I maybe in my sense, I sometimes I miss you guys. I feel like people that work at universities stick with other people that work at universities, and there could be a better bridge between policy and research, and between I think from the government side, they could also reach out more to researchers and also, but from civil society organizations and private sector. I've spent a lot of time writing policy recommendations on sustainable development, but I rarely ever, had a conversation with any of the Swedish universities that probably knew much more than I did, but I wanted to make it convincing to the politicians in my previous roles. So maybe the partnership would be a leadership angle.
One last comment, Erik?
I'm in the Swedish government's scientific advisory board for sustainable development, and in that group of 12 researchers from all universities, or from different universities and subjects in Sweden, I raised this question that the government should ask the universities to provide information and have a plan for the reduction of their own climate impact. And it was turned down by those 12 researchers as not a very important question to have the universities behave in relation to the Paris Agreement.
Okay. Kevin?
Sorry,
Erik, I'll interrupt you there.
Well, quickly, certainly on the activities and the operations of universities, they're like the rest of society. Their emissions are just going up. So they're not making any positive moves that are overcoming their desire to grow, and that growing, of course, is also more and more international students which are beneficial culturally and intellectually, but will come with a massive carbon footprint and locked-in carbon footprint for all the relationships that then develop across people that live across the globe. So those things are not being dealt with appropriately. But the other problem, I think, is much more fundamental, is that universities have been phenomenally successful, as has global development of knowledge, in reductionism. We are very good at being deterministic, at reducing problems to their small little silos. So we have economists, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, philosophers, humanities. We have all of these disciplines. And that has been very successful for, post-Enlightenment as a driver for the Industrial Revolution. We now, in 2017, are facing system-level problems, and we do not know how to address system-level problems. We have not thought like that for hundreds of years, if ever. So we've never faced these challenges before. And at the moment, universities are just part of the problem, because they don't know how to do that. They are trying. So the CEMUS group at Uppsala is a good example of trying to pull different disciplines together, but not just to put them together, but try to facilitate some sort of fusion of different ways of thinking and methods. It's not just about teams. It's much more than that. This is difficult. This is terrain we don't understand. So universities here at the moment are as much part of the problem as they are the solution, but they could turn that around, I think. And the other thing, I think two other things on this. One is, where are the students? Now, the students have acted before. They've been out there with their campaigns, not in the odd 3s and 4s and 5s, but in hundreds and thousands of them, making life very difficult for other people, including their own universities. We don't see that anymore. So we need to somehow engender that spirit of students being, revolting. You can read that in two ways. The other thing I think is really obvious. I work in the climate change realm, and I engage a lot of the sort of the very well-known climate change scientists. You may know some of them. Some of them are Swedish, but they will not say in public what they say in private because they're scared of the status quo. And I've been at events recently when very well-known Swedish scientists have said these things. That they can't. Well, I can't say that in public. I can't tell the policymakers that. Now that is disturbing. When we've got people who are academics who could not, they're not at risk of being sacked. These people have very high reputations, and yet they still run scared of being able to say what their science tells them. There's something wrong with the society or with the university system when that degree of fear has spread to the most senior people in our universities.
I'm aware of the time here, so I'm going to ask the panel to wrap up. If you take into consideration the mammoth changes that you mentioned, Ranjula, who will you be talking to now, or what will you tweet, or what form of activism will you do if, like Kevin, you want to sink all the boats in the harbor here? 10 seconds each. What will you do now to address the issues that we've covered today?
When I heard Kevin, I thought that, and I took notes. I heard him yesterday morning as well to prepare, and I've heard him before. And I think that this message is so clear. And so just by taking notes, I have a debate article finished. So I was figuring out, should I invite Kevin as a co-author or should I just steal it? But I will try to publish it.
Thank you. Kevin?
I'm not trying to be deliberately upbeat here, but to me the challenge is absolutely enormous. But we have all the tools at our disposal to respond to that challenge. And what we lack is the courage to start putting those tools into place.
Hanna?
Well, I'll do two things in my job because we have kind of two tasks in the delegation. The first one is to make sure now that the government acts on the recommendations that we've given, that I'm convinced will put Sweden closer towards reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. And the other side is continuing this task that we have of having this conversation with different actors in society. And that's, from all parts of the world and or parts of the country, but also all actors. So continue having this discussion and bringing out the good ideas and hopefully pooling them.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I think that some of the climate change is going to impose some of the changes on us. So we'll have no choice and we'll have to just... And some of the changes we should impose on people. And thus making choices, trying to target policymakers in terms of making regulatory changes and, imposing things in terms of restricting wasteful consumption and things like that. That would, because the other things, technological changes, reaching through economic policies, there's an amount of time involved, and also we don't know exactly how it's going to work, so yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Kevin, for the presentation, and thank you for Erik, Hanna, and Ranjula for joining us for the conversation. Thank you to you all. This is it for today, but I'm sure that you're welcome to come after this session and talk to the panel for more discussions. Thank you.